We are back on the Zero Hour. My next guest is, I would call her a semi-regular on this program. I always look forward to speaking with her very much, and I respect the work she does. Rebecca Vallas is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where her work focuses on economic justice. Before that, she was at the Center for American Progress. She also has a program that is on the verge of relaunching, I believe, called Off Kilter. And she's been working very closely on issues of health, issues of fair infrastructure rebuilding, how to build back better for broad populations, including the disabled and the elderly. And so once again, Rebecca Vallas, thanks for coming on the program.
Always a pleasure to be here, RJ. Always love getting to hang out with you, even when things are as sort of zany and chaotic as they are right now. It's a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, same here. And zany and chaotic, don't tell a half of it. But let's do this. I feel, right now in Washington, that sometimes I feel these weeks, especially, are like a vortex of changes, forces, conflicts, debates, discussions going forward. And so I'm constantly like in a swimming, when you like cannonball into a swimming pool, you don't know which way is up. That's where I am with a number of issues that I care a lot about now. And one of them is the treatment being afforded the disabled in this country. And I know you mentioned before we began recording that we just had a birthday of the Americans with Disabilities Act, if I'm recalling our conversation correctly. And so why don't we start with that? When was the ADA passed? What were its basic goals? How are we doing with it?
Yeah, the Americans with Disabilities Act, RJ, the ADA, as it's often called, it's almost approached cliche levels in American culture. Everyone knows what the ADA is, everyone's heard of it, but a lot of people assume that because we've had the ADA for 30 years and running at this point, it was signed into law by George H.W. Bush in 1990, and actually it was really a bipartisan victory at the time. A lot of people say, oh, well, we've got the ADA, so didn't we fix that disability rights problem? Don't we just have equal opportunity and access for people with disabilities in the US at this point because of the ADA? And I've got some news for your listeners and your viewers. The ADA was huge landmark legislation, obviously, in terms of taking a leapfrog set of steps forward for our society. And it was intended to create equal opportunity and access for people with disabilities in the United States of America. However, we are still in a place where we don't have full disability rights and disability justice. And the goals underpinning the enactment and the signing of the ADA more than 30 years ago have still not been achieved here in the United States. There are other key pieces of legislation that are also really, I think, important to mention and that don't get nearly as much attention as the ADA. One of those is known as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, another incredibly important piece of disability civil rights legislation. Folks may actually be a little more familiar with Section 504 these days because of the film Crip Camp, which brought to light a lot of that history, and in particular, an incredible disability rights leader, Judy Heumann, who features prominently in that Oscar-winning film. Telling the story of some of how it came to be and the disability sit-ins that brought about that important piece of legislation. There's also another important law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, huge advent in terms of educational access, because it wasn't that long ago that in the United States, people with disabilities were largely segregated and warehoused in institutions rather than being integrated into our community. And that was true, including in schools where students with disabilities were not mainstreamed until fairly recently within US history. So all of this, right, is the set of victories and the set of progress that we celebrate every year in July when we mark the Americans with Disabilities Act anniversary. But really, and this is where I'm going to come back to for I think the rest of our conversation. What's really important is that we not rest on our laurels, check the box, and say, great, we did that disability rights thing, because the status quo is still not acceptable nor anywhere approaching equal rights and equal access and equal opportunity for people with disabilities. And the COVID pandemic, which disproportionately hit disabled people and seniors it harder than almost anyone, has been such a stark reminder of how far we still have to go.
That's really well said, Rebecca. And in a sense, I was thinking as you were speaking about the parallels between the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and the ADA and associated legislation, in that they began a process, a sort of evolutionary process, which is not only legal and legislative, but is also social and cultural and so on. So, for example, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, we didn't fully understand the nature of racism as much as we do now. We, and many of us, have much more to learn. We didn't understand the variety and nature of groups that were having their civil rights suppressed, and we've broadened our understanding of that. In a sense, I feel it's the same way with the disabled, that while the visibly physically disabled are a critically important group whose rights need to be fought for, that the population of the disabled in this country is much broader than people realize, much more varied than people realize, and struggling with many more barriers than people originally realized. Ramps, access ramps, are, for example, are critically important, but that's the beginning of the process. It's not the end of the process, and even those have not been adequately installed in enough places. So we need to understand all the ways of hearing loss and vision loss and cognitive loss and emotional problems and so on factor into it, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's really, I think, the significance of the breadth of the definition of disability in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is not just about physical disabilities. That image of the person in a wheelchair, right, is what most people often picture. And it also is what dominates media depictions and portrayals of disabilities. But disability and the disability community are not a homogenous group. We're talking about 1 in 4 Americans are considered to have disabilities under that ADA definition. So it's an incredibly large and heterogeneous group, and it includes many other disability types beyond physical disabilities, mental, as cognitive, as you mentioned, sensory, and many people experience multiple types of disabilities, right, and are not defined by just one specific disability category. Another category, though, and this is where this particular anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act has made a little bit of history. Chronic illness and I am a person who lives with chronic illness, so this is fairly personal for me. And also, I'm someone who identifies as a member of the disability community through living with disabling chronic illness. Chronic illness has often been not viewed as part of the disability community in many people's minds, because it's often invisible. You might see me on the street, right, and you don't see me moving around in a wheelchair or using crutches to walk by.
Right.
You're not going to look at me and go, man, she looks like those 1 in 4 people with disabilities. The same is true for people who are now experiencing long haul, quote unquote, long haul COVID symptoms. And this is a growing set of individuals in this country. We still don't have a great handle on how many people are going to be impacted at the end of the day by long haul COVID symptoms, but an increasing number of people who did not recover fully and are now plagued with long-term health conditions and problems and limitations as a result of having been impacted by COVID, are now making up a population of people called COVID long haulers. I put that in scare quotes because it's a term that is now being used to define this group. And those individuals, per President Biden, in his speech in front of the White House on the last week, on the day that marked the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act into law over 30 years ago, he announced that COVID long haulers are now going to be considered having a disability under federal civil rights laws. And that is a really significant announcement, given that those individuals, and again, their ranks are growing by the day, and we don't have a good handle on quite how many people that's going to be at the end of all of this. Those individuals now are going to be afforded rights and protections, and the for example, the right to request workplace accommodations if that's important for them to be able to stay attached to the workforce, and will, I think, start to see in the coming weeks and months ahead what the significance is for COVID long haulers in being able to access federal rights and disability protections like other individuals who previously have been considered to have disabilities under federal law. And so that was a pretty significant announcement from President Biden last week, and really another reminder that we have the largest influx of new entrants to the disability community happening right now in this COVID pandemic in modern history. And it is really changing the national conversation that we're having about disability and the disability community and disability rights and justice in ways that advocates like me are hoping start to help us chart a course towards finally realizing the goals of the ADA more than 30 years later.
And again, we're talking with Rebecca Vallas of the Century Foundation. Rebecca, I also am one of the 1 in 4, and also is not visible to anyone who sees me. But among other things, I have a hearing impairment that wasn't diagnosed till I was in my late 30s. I have ADD, so I have a cognitive impairment. And that, by the way, is a tricky combination too, because so I know what it's like to be, stigmatized for that, and that's part of what I want to talk about. Is that we're still, as I said in my introduction, or I think in my reaction to your comments about the ADA, there's this pairing of the political and legislative struggle and judicial struggle with the social struggle and the understanding that many of us struggled with Richard does not perform up to his abilities or whatever, or jobs where I was considered a low performer because no adjustments were. I didn't even know adjustments needed to be made, and I think that's part of the struggle here. I didn't know I was considered disabled until and I talked with Rebecca Coakley, our mutual friend, about this, who works in this field full time and is a great leader in it, until I went to an airline once to find out what to do about my hearing aids when they started X-raying or putting everyone in those machines. And it took me to their accommodations for the disabled page. And this is why I bring it up, because my initial reaction was, hey, wait a minute. I'm not disabled. I just have a little, this problem with my hearing. Let's not go labeling me now. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. I think a lot of people, that was in sort of internalized bias, bigotry, whatever you want to call it, on my part that I had to get over and a sense of shame and all of the things that people associate with. And from what I've heard, I was also thinking about the women who struggled for so many years with that disease that primarily strikes women, and they were labeled, I'm blanking on the name of it now, but it was labeled psychological, and they had to deal with being dismissed by doctors because they didn't believe there was a physical basis for it, and frankly because it was targeting women. I just think there are so many ways in which our struggle is not just, it's a great step for President Biden to say this, but to me, there also has to be a national dialogue, for lack of a better term, about who's disabled, what it means to be disabled, why there should be no shame or stigma associated to the disabled, and perhaps most importantly, why we all benefit by providing these accommodations. While that gives us more fully functioning members of society, which enrich us in a million different ways. But I'll stop lecturing and let you talk.
No, I love when you get on the soapbox, RJ, especially on issues that are close to both of our hearts. No, I want to associate myself with all those comments, and I completely agree and think you're really hitting the nail on the head here. And I think the thing to really make clear is that we've spent a long time as a society looking at disability as something that describes a broken person, right? There's this
Right.
kind of pity charity model that's been applied for a long time. Oh, the least among us. Oh, the most vulnerable. Oh, those poor people who are, quote, suffering from disabilities. What we are now starting to, I think, move into, and the transition that we're starting to see as the disability community becomes stronger and more politically powerful and more vocal and more visible as a voting bloc, as a part of society that has increasing and I think visibly exercised political power, particularly which we saw during the Trump administration, when it was the disability community who really rose up and put their bodies on the line in many cases to save the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid and other critical programs for people beyond the disability community, but especially critical for the disability community. We are now in a moment where it is disabled leaders speaking up for themselves to say, instead of talking about me, instead of telling me what I want, instead of assuming that I don't have quality of life, how about I get the microphone and get to tell you what it's like, and that what I just need is accommodations and accessibility. And so we're moving from kind of that medical model, that model of shame and blame, as you were putting it, RJ, into a conversation now about, well, actually, disability is part of diversity in our community.
Right.
Disability is part of can actually be an area that brings someone community and that brings someone power. And disability is not something that makes someone less than, or less than fully human, less than part of our society, unless we as a society choose to treat people with disabilities as less than fully human or as less than full members of society. And that is the way that we as a society have behaved historically and up until fairly recently, as we turn the corner with key civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we have a long way to go to really fully be treating people with disabilities as full members of society. And a big part of that really is actually bubbling up in Congress right now in this debate around, quote unquote, Build Back Better, this debate around economic recovery legislation and infrastructure that is not getting nearly as much attention in the mainstream media as it probably should, given the stakes here, but which is certainly dominating Capitol Hill and really kind of the inside the Beltway discourse right now. And the reason that conversation about treating people with disabilities as full members of society is really at the heart of much of what's being debated in Washington right now, is because on the line at issue right now is the opportunity, a historic opportunity, I should note, to finally fully invest in something called home and community-based services. Some people have been calling this an acronym, HCBS. And it has gotten some level of attention in the media because of how much it would mean for disabled people and for seniors. But HCBS it's the type of services that allow people with disabilities and older Americans to live in their homes and in their communities rather than needing to be warehoused in institutions. In so many ways, the debate we're having right now in Washington and nationally as a society, whether or not to make that historic investment so that people with disabilities and seniors are no longer languishing on waiting lists, trying to finally get access to those services and dying in nursing homes right
Right.
from COVID as a result, is because there's a proposal. President Biden proposed to invest $400 billion in HCBS. He proposed that on the campaign trail. He also then reiterated that commitment as president. And that would allow us to finally have adequate funding for this critical set of services that is key to finally achieving the goal of full community integration. People with disabilities do not want to be largely warehoused in institutions, isolated, away from family, from friends, and not in a capacity where they can really participate as part of their communities and as part of society. These are the kinds of services that allow people to live in their homes and often to work and to be quote unquote participating, productive members of society. That is what is at stake here with this HCBS debate. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a number of members of Congress trying to shrink this package. And we're seeing the likes of Kirsten Sinema from Arizona and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, for example, wielding outsized power within the Democratic Party, trying to shrink this overall package in a way that will mean that that commitment that President Biden made to finally eliminate those waiting lists and ensure that all disabled people and seniors are able to access those services so that they can live independently and work and have full community integration, that number is getting shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And we are seeing disability community leaders rise up and raise their voices and say, we need that full $400 billion commitment so that we can do right by the disability community and finally achieve those goals of the ADA more than 30 years later. And we're not entirely sure how this is going to play out. But that is one of the things that is really at stake right now in that recovery debate.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Rebecca, because it's critically important. It's on the table right now. I know that the favorite tactic of Republicans, I don't know if any Democrats have embraced it, but has been to say, for example, well, we're talking about Build Back Better, which is infrastructure, and home care is not infrastructure. I wrote a piece pointing out that the dictionary definitions of infrastructure, the historical usage of the word infrastructure, have always included what some people call soft infrastructure, because infrastructure is whatever you need in the way of physical or organizational structure to allow people to function in society and to allow the interactions that make up a society to flow. So it's absolutely infrastructure, number one. But whatever you call it, it's so vitally important. I went through this, I had caretaking responsibility for my mother, and I went through this when she was in decline, when she had dementia. And I certainly was not able to care for her, and she had these hopes of leaving a little bit of money to her kids. We had all of that more had to go to this very expensive, and they were nice people, but ultimately alienating process. If we could have gotten home care for her, it would have made such a difference. And also, I do want to point out that not only does this home care proposal, HCBS, I guess it's called, is the acronym, not only is it vitally important for millions of people leading a decent life, which we all have a right to do as long as we're living, but it also helps the workers who support them. And there's so many reasons why that's important. Number one, just humane and fair. These workers should not be underpaid. I did that work myself as a college student, and it's extremely physically and emotionally demanding work.
Okay, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know
Yeah,
that you
I
had
was.
experience as a home care worker. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. No, I wasn't a home care worker. I was a nurse's aide in
Oh,
a
okay.
chronic diseases facility. So I worked a lot with the elderly and with the severely ill and the chronically ill. And it was emotionally tough for an 18-year-old to confront death and dead bodies and the very ill and the end of life. And everyone was underpaid. I wrote a piece about it for NBC News, and it basically ended with them letting me go, saying, Richard has a wonderful rapport with the patients, but is not very good at the actual job that requirements. So okay, live and learn. But that was the ADD actually at work, but I didn't know it. And but it taught me a lot. Caring for my mom and watching what she had to go through and the enormous stress and strain, financial, emotional, on the family. This is so important in so many ways, and my fear from the beginning has been that somehow it'll get dealt away, that there's just somewhat whatever, there's not enough special interest money, or not enough construction contracts to let, or whatever it is. But I feel very, very protective of this proposal and very bonded to it, for lack of a better term. So I don't know. What do you think? How's it looking right now?
Well, it I would say that everything is extremely fluid right now. In That's the word of the day, fluid. When it comes to this debate going on Capitol Hill right now, the infrastructure package is the big focus of the Senate in this particular moment this week as we're talking. And as you mentioned before, that infrastructure package, which began, let's remember, as President Biden proposing the American Jobs Plan, and let's do not just roads and bridges, which is hugely important, but also human infrastructure, as you were describing, right? That was where we were talking about doing paid leave and childcare, but also really importantly, this home and community-based services element of human infrastructure. And I'm totally with you. All of that really is part of infrastructure, I think, if adequately defined. But what we saw was Republicans come back and say, oh, no, 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 we don't want to do anything but roads and bridges. And we actually don't even want to do all the roads and bridges work that Biden wants to do. We want to do just this little sliver of it. And all that human infrastructure stuff, no, that sounds way too lefty for us. We don't want any part of that. So the package became very, very small, slimmed down, and none of that human infrastructure stuff that Biden had proposed, like HCBS. Now, what we're looking at instead is a second package, which is where Democrats functionally need to put all of President Biden's priorities that Republicans would not agree to in yet another partisan reconciliation effort, kind of like we saw, very much like we saw with the American Rescue Plan Act, which became law in March of this year, over Republican objections and without a single Republican vote. Because they didn't want to authorize things like the child allowance, which will cut child poverty in half, right, in the next year. Those were not things Republicans were fans of. So now we're watching a repeat of that performance from earlier this year, with Democrats saying, okay, well, then we've got to do one more reconciliation package. A reconciliation, again, being a term that is a sort of a budget term in the Senate. It has to do with a process that allows a party to pass a piece of legislation with only 50 votes. And in this case, Democrats, of course, have Vice President Harris as the tiebreaker to get to 51. And that's the process that allows them to do something, even though they don't have 60 votes to overcome filibuster. And so that's what we're now looking at for the next package to follow this infrastructure slice that Republicans are willing to do, or at least willing to do so far. That could still fall apart as well. And we have to watch and wait and see how that goes. And it's that reconciliation package, that second package, that is where we are now watching priorities like home and community-based services, as well as paid leave and childcare, and extending that child allowance, which was only authorized for 1 year to cut child poverty in half for just 1 year earlier this year in the American Rescue Plan. All of those priorities are now getting lumped into this reconciliation package. And that's the package that, unfortunately, because of some of the members of the Democratic caucus who are very much on the right wing of the Democratic caucus, like I mentioned, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema in particular, although I would say my senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, deserves a shout out for not being on the right side of this one as well. They're all crunching the package down and saying, well, we're getting the willies about spending more money. And that's the debate that we're starting to watch play out in public, rather than just behind closed doors. And so the concern is that $400 billion for HCBS, which would eliminate those waiting lists and mean that all of a sudden, if you're a person who's eligible for home and community-based services, you can access them, as opposed to languishing on a waiting list for years, waiting for those services and needing to live in an institution in the meantime, so that you can get to that point where you're allowed to be a full participating member of society. That number is getting crunched down, and what we're hearing in the chatter is that it might be right now as little as 150 billion, which sounds like a big number, but is nowhere approaching what would be necessary to fulfill Biden's commitment to ensure that all disabled people and all seniors are able to access these critical home and community-based services if they need them in order to live in the community. And RJ, just a point of history, I mentioned before that it wasn't that long ago that in this country, And I think folks who are, a little older than me remember some of this history. So you might remember some of this history. It wasn't that long ago, really prior to basically the 60s and 70s, that people with disabilities were warehoused in institutions. That was the state of things in the U.S., especially children, but people of all ages with various types of disabilities, and particularly people with cognitive disabilities like
Right.
intellectual
Absolutely.
disabilities, developmental disabilities. And so what we saw in the promises of the Americans with Disabilities Act, in the establishment of the Medicaid program, and so much else, was a societal pledge that people with disabilities should have access to living in the community if that is what they want. And because we haven't seen an adequate investment in deinstitutionalization in the form of these home and community-based services, we have yet to realize those promises from more than 30 years ago. And that is why I keep harkening back to the anniversary of the ADA is a moment to celebrate, but it's also a moment to look at our report card as a nation and say, how are we doing on these promises? And until we actually make good on that HCBS investment and so much more, we're not going to be where we promised we would be. I want to note one other policy that is also being debated in this moment, and actually, you and I talked about it on your program the last time that I was on. It's another top priority for the disability community and for seniors, and that is to update and expand the Supplemental Security Income Program, SSI, critical part of our Social Security system that gets forgotten. It's been forgotten for almost 50 years by Congress, which is why basic elements of the program haven't even been updated for frickin' inflation, like the asset limits, like income rules. And the benefits are not enough for anyone to live on. The maximum benefit you can get from SSI is just $794 a month. No one can live on that. You can't even afford rent anywhere in the United States if you pay 100% of your benefits towards rent on 794. And yet that is what we are trapping disabled people and seniors, 8 million of them, in, because we haven't updated that program. And that's why the disability community has come together with the seniors community and Social Security groups to call on Congress to include long overdue updates to SSI alongside that investment in HCBS, home and community-based services, in this reconciliation package, so that we can finally start treating disabled people in this country as fully human and full members of society rather than relegating them to second class status any longer. And that's, I think, worth an important mention alongside this HCBS conversation that we're having.
Yeah, that's really important, Rebecca. And I guess I would conclude by, I didn't want to give a litany of my own problems, but I turned 65 and then immediately developed a chronic disease as well. And I think I estimated last year that treating it cost Uncle Sam, if you will, Medicare, about $100,000. And of course, people like the Peterson crowd or whatever, the deficit crowd, government deficit crowd, might say that was money poorly spent in many ways. But because it just astounds me when we're talking about not only quality of life but saving lives, because death rates are high in these institutions and so on, especially during a pandemic, that when people worry about the federal deficit, I think our biggest national problem is an empathy deficit. And I guess I would just end on the note by saying, I love that you're working on this because, among other things, you're helping people to understand the problem, and perhaps that understanding will reduce the empathy deficit on this and so many other issues. But I'll leave you with the last word.
Well, I think the last word I want to give is because I know you have an incredibly engaged listenership and viewership. Folks don't just want to know about what's going on, they want to know how they can take action. Now is the moment for folks who are so inclined to call your members of Congress. The switchboard number for the Capitol, so they can connect you to whoever your members are, if you just tell them where you live, is 202 224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. Very easy. They'll connect you with your representatives in the House, but also your senators. And now is the moment to be saying we can't afford to leave the disability community behind, and we can't afford to leave seniors behind in this package. We need that investment in HCBS. We need that investment in SSI so that we finally start treating Americans with disabilities like fully human members of this society rather than relegating them to second class status. There's also a really easy way that folks can weigh in on the SSI piece of this. They can actually text SSI now, SSINOW, to 50409. That's SSI now to 50409. You can just send that text message and it walks you through something that takes about 3 minutes to send letters to your members of Congress and your representatives. And that's a really easy way to raise your voice as well. So can't end a conversation like this without telling people what they can do right now to make a difference. But RJ, thank you for everything that you do on your program to elevate these issues. And I always love talking with you, especially about issues that we care about so much.
I feel exactly the same way. So, Rebecca Vallas, Senior Fellow with the Century Foundation, thank you for all the great work you do. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Always great to see you, RJ.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.